Good afternoon, Professor.
Mr. Thompson?
Nice to see you, sir. Now, of the 10 largest cities in the United States, how many of them have protections against discrimination against gays and lesbians? Do you know?
I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of that, but I would suspect the number is probably in the 8 or 9 range. That's quite common. Municipal enactments, of course, have limitations.
Now, you live in California, is that correct?
I do.
And you donated money to the No on 8 campaign, is that correct?
I did.
And you recall that about 8 days after the Prop 8 campaign, you participated in a panel discussion at Stanford with Simon Jackson.
Simon Jackman.
Jackman?
I participated in a course lecture with Simon Jackman.
Okay, and do you recall that the subject of Prop 8 came up during that discussion?
It certainly did.
And do you recall your colleague saying that you felt very strongly about Prop 8?
I don't remember exactly what he said. I don't have it committed to memory, but it wouldn't surprise me.
You do feel very strongly about Prop 8, don't you?
I believe in the equality of persons under the law, and as a consequence, the constitutional establishment of inequality is something I find deeply offensive.
And I'd like to nail down some terms that you used during your direct. When an individual answering a poll is asked about gays or lesbians, a variety of things might enter their mind. Is that correct?
Presumably, yes.
It might mean sexual conduct to some, correct?
It may.
Or it could be some sort of behavioral trappings of what the person might stereotypically believe to be gay or lesbian, correct?
It may.
Or it may be associated with an individual person, a member of the family, a coworker, correct?
That's correct.
It's really hard to say what jumps into someone's mind when they hear the term gay or lesbian, correct?
Hard to say in the sense that there's more than one notion that could enter their mind. We could define the universe of likely items that would be considered by a respondent, so that's not particularly hard to say. But to ask what any individual is thinking of when he or she answers the question, it could be a fairly limited set of options.
All right. Well, let's talk about the definition of political power. The exercise of power, in your opinion, is moving someone from opposition or fence-sitting into your own column, correct?
That would be part of it. Another possibility would be persuading them to stand down, to no longer oppose, even if they themselves haven't changed their opinion. Or it may be mustering the political forces necessary to circumvent them.
And under your definition of power, if the group had power, it would be able to cajole or compel members of the legislature to produce an outcome that they might not have been predisposed to produce, correct?
That would be part of it. I would also want to be concerned about so it's not just achieving an outcome, but sort of securing it from likely reversal.
And you believe that gays and lesbians have to rely almost exclusively on allies who are regularly shown to be insufficiently strong or reliable to achieve or protect their interests, correct?
I believe as a general proposition that that's true. That there are allies, even more reliable allies, but that if we looked across the universe of potential allies, that the number of allies is smaller than is necessary, and that many of those allies are unreliable.
And applying your definition of political power, you believe the NAACP had a meaningful degree of political power even when Newt Gingrich was the Speaker of the House, correct?
I think it's in the case that they had less power when Newt Gingrich was the Speaker than the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives. But even under those circumstances, I would say that they had a fair degree of influence.
All right. Your Honor, we'd like to pass out some binders, if we may.
Very well.
Thank you, Your Honor.
I wondered where the binders were.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Yeah, you may.
Professor, I'd like to direct your attention to tab 7, and in particular, this is the 2007 annual report of the Human Rights Campaign. It's DIX 1330. The Human Rights Campaign is a leading gay rights advocacy group. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I'd like to direct your attention to page 4 of this document. It's actually the 6th page of the exhibit. It has a little 4 in the bottom left-hand column.
I'm there.
Okay. And directing your attention to the 3rd paragraph, it says in the 2nd sentence, We were named by the well-respected National Journal the single most effective non-union progressive organization working in the 2006 midterm elections. Using your definition of political power, do you think the Human Rights Campaign had a meaningful degree of political power in the 2006 midterm elections?
I do not.
All right. And in the next sentence, the annual report says, we played a decisive role in electing fair-minded majorities to the U.S. House and Senate and to legislatures from Oregon to New Hampshire. But using your definition of political power, you don't believe the Human Rights Campaign has a meaningful degree of political power, correct?
I do not. I don't.
And in California, the incoming speaker is John Perez, is that correct?
That's correct.
Of the Assembly?
Yes.
I think he's
already taken office, hasn't he?
Correct, yes.
He may have, actually.
Thank you, Your Honor. And Mr. Perez is openly gay, is that correct?
That's my understanding.
And he was unanimously elected to the speakership of the California Assembly, is that correct, by the Democratic caucus?
After the alternative candidates withdrew, yes.
But under your definition of political power, gays and lesbians do not have a meaningful degree of political power in the California Assembly, even though the speaker is openly gay, correct?
That's correct, because again, outcome does not reveal process.
Applying your definition of political power, biblical literalists have more political power in the California legislature than the gay and lesbian community, correct?
If we looked at their representation among the elected officials, that would be my conclusion.
And if we look at outcomes, would that be your conclusion as well?
Again, outcomes are a particularly difficult thing to rely on because we have to understand how the outcome came about.
Well, if we look at domestic partnerships, the gay and lesbian community supported those in 1999 in California, correct?
That would be my assumption, yes.
And the biblical literalists opposed it, correct?
That's correct.
And the gay and lesbian community won that fight, correct?
Again, process matters, but yes, the answer to that is yes, that's correct.
And then in 2003, there was an expansion of the domestic partnership law in California, correct?
That's what I understand.
And the gay and lesbian community supported that expansion?
I'm sure they did.
And the biblical literalists opposed it?
I would assume.
And even though the gay and lesbian community won that fight, you say they have less power in the California legislature than biblical literalists, correct?
I say that they have less power in the California legislature because they're less represented. Their representation is augmented by Democratic control. Should there be a Republican control, they would have no power whatsoever.
If a group is successful in getting legal protections against discrimination aimed at that group, that would be a positive factor that you would weigh in assessing political power, correct?
It would be a positive factor with the consideration that the discrimination exists in the first place.
And gays and lesbians in California have many legal protections against discrimination, correct?
I'm sorry, many? I don't you have to be specific about what that term means.
Well, haven't there been over 50 pieces of legislation over the last 10 years that have sought to protect the legal rights of gays and lesbians in California?
I don't think it would be a fair statement to say that in 50 cases the interests of gays and lesbians were codified into law. I think it would be fair to say that there are anti-discrimination lines in at least 50 pieces of legislation. Now, you are correct that some of those pieces of legislation did, in fact, grant protection from discrimination to gays and lesbians, and as I indicated in my direct, some of that was in response to court decisions.
Can you identify any state in the union that has more legal protections for gays and lesbians than California?
I cannot.
Using your definition of political power, can you give any example of the Hispanic community in Congress exercising political power during the last 10 years?
Well, I could think of the role that they may have played in attempting to stop immigration legislation when the current minority was the majority. They certainly played a role in rallying forces to stop the attempt to criminalize the presence in the United States of undocumented persons. That would be an example.
Any other examples?
I'm sure if I thought for a while I could.
Now, in New Hampshire, gays and lesbians have secured through the legislative process the right to same-sex marriage, correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
But using your definition of political power, your initial reaction would be that gays and lesbians do not have a meaningful degree of political power in New Hampshire, correct?
That would be my initial reaction because I would need to understand the legislative history and the legislative circumstances surrounding the enactment of that protection. I would also want to know whether or not that protection is likely to be subject to reversal.
And so do you have an opinion on whether gays and lesbians in New Hampshire have a meaningful degree of political power?
I don't have sufficient information in my hand to answer that.
And in Vermont, gays and lesbians have secured through the legislative process the right to same-sex marriage, correct?
Again, I'm uncomfortable with this notion that gays and lesbians have secured. The Vermont legislator has, in fact, passed same-sex marriage legislation. That's my understanding.
At the urging of the gay and lesbian community.
Well, certainly not with their opposition, but they weren't in a position to compel the legislator to do so. But they certainly they asked.
But using your definition of political power, you would suggest that gays and lesbians do not have a meaningful degree of political power in Vermont, correct?
Again, it would be difficult for me to make a full-length statement about the circumstances in Vermont without knowing the legislative history and the circumstances of gays and lesbians in the various state and county governments. I also want to reiterate that my understanding of political power is very nationally oriented. That is that those gays and lesbians newly enfranchised with the right to marry in New Hampshire and Vermont don't have those marriages recognized by the federal government. Nor can the domestic partners registered in California visit ill domestic partners in Nevada or Louisiana. There's no guarantee those rights are accepted. So we need to think of this not solely on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis, but also across layers of government.
Well, is a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis irrelevant to your analysis?
It's not irrelevant, but we certainly would have to consider both.
Okay. Now, gays and lesbians have the right to marry in Massachusetts, correct?
That is correct.
And gays and lesbians were able to defeat an effort to restore the traditional definition of marriage in Massachusetts, correct?
Defeat is an interesting term. My understanding was that in the legislature there was maneuvering to prevent it from coming up for vote. I'm sorry, I don't have exhaustive command of the Massachusetts legislature.
And at present in Massachusetts, there is no effort to repeal same-sex marriage because any effort would be futile, correct?
Again, I don't know if I can conclude that. I would think as long as the Democrats retain the majority in the Commonwealth lower house, that it would be difficult to do that. But I can't say for sure that there would be none.
But using your definition of political power, gays and lesbians do not have a meaningful degree of political power in Massachusetts, correct?
To the extent that they, mustering their own resources, can't defend their basic rights, and that those rights do not travel with them across state lines, no, they do not.
And would the same answer obtain for Connecticut, that even though there's same-sex marriage under your definition, gays and lesbians do not have a meaningful degree of political power in Connecticut?
And Iowa?
Okay, thank you. In Washington, D.C., the D.C. City Council passed a bill that would legalize same-sex marriage in the District of Columbia, correct?
That's my understanding.
But using your definition of political power, gays and lesbians do not have a meaningful degree of political power in Washington, D.C., correct?
Again, thinking of the context moving across levels of government, I would say that no gay or lesbian in the United States enjoys a meaningful degree of political power.
And in Houston, where there's an openly lesbian mayor, your opinion would be that there's not a meaningful degree of political power in Houston for gays and lesbians. Is that correct?
Nor are there even domestic partner benefits for city employees, so that is correct.
Now, Mayor Sanders has testified that 2 out of the 8 city council members in San Diego are openly gay. Are you aware of that?
I am.
And Mayor Sanders himself is an ally of the LGBT community, correct?
I would say that he is today, yes.
And using your definition of political power, gays and lesbians do not have a meaningful degree of political power in San Diego, correct?
That is correct. Because gays and lesbians in San Diego, in 2 ways, gays and lesbians in San Diego remain constitutionally established as second-class citizens. And as Mayor Sanders testified, the gay and lesbian group in San Diego is not sufficiently powerful to prompt fear of any sort of compliance from its legislators.
And turning your attention to tab 15, please, in your binder.
Uh-huh.
There is a New York Times, and by the way, Your Honor, I believe I neglected to request permission to move into evidence DIX 1330, which is the Human Rights Campaign Annual Report of 2007.
No objection, Your Honor.
Very well, 1330 is admitted.
And turning your attention to tab 13 in your binder, Professor, it's DIX 2554. This is a New York Times article entitled, Gay Candidates Get Support That Causes May Not. And it's dated December 28th, 2009. In the 5th paragraph, it states, there are currently at least 445 openly gay and lesbian people holding elected office in the United States, up from 257 8 years ago. And are those numbers accurate to the best of your knowledge?
I have no basis of which to evaluate them. I have no reason to believe that they are inaccurate.
Didn't you have numbers like that in your opening report?
I did, but my numbers were dissaturated by level of government.
And turning to the 3rd paragraph from the bottom, it talks about Charles Poog, an openly gay former broadcaster, swept to victory as city council president in Detroit in his first bid for public office. Using your definition of political power, gays and lesbians do not have a meaningful degree of political power in Detroit, even though the president of the city council is openly gay, correct?
That would be correct, because I would look at the preferences of the remaining members of the city council, the attitudes of the states of Michigan's legislator, the absence of any form of non-discrimination legislation in Michigan, and the absence of protective legislation at the federal level. So residents of the city of Detroit reside not just in Detroit, but in Wayne County, in Michigan, in the United States.
Now, we turn to the 2nd page of this article, which is actually the 3rd page behind the tab. We can see that in the 7th paragraph, it starts in Detroit.
Yes.
It says, in Detroit, Mr. Poog's sexuality never became an issue in his race for city council. Quote, I thought I would be attacked during the campaign for being gay, close quote. He said in an interview. I wasn't. It was a pleasant surprise. Isn't it true that in many big cities, it's an increasingly irrelevant whether a candidate is gay or lesbian?
Well, I think that would depend on which big city. So I would respond to this in 2 ways. First, the candidate did expect to be attacked for his sexuality. And second, in the previous example you mentioned in the city of Houston, her sexuality was very much at issue. Her opponent used it to try to diminish her support. So I don't think it is in the case that being gay or lesbian is a footnote of no interest to voters in many big cities. There are certainly big cities where it is less important than it might previously have been other than in other cities. But I don't think it's fair to say that it's an insignificant element of a candidate's identity today.
Your Honor, we would move the admission of DIX 2554.
Your Honor, I'm going to object on hearsay grounds. I have no objection to it coming in for the fact of the article, but not for the truth of the matter asserted.
Your Honor, it relates to a legislative fact.
I think the witness has opened the door to this. 2554 will be admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor. Turning your attention, Professor, to tab 16, this is a story in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, dated October 10th, 2009. It's entitled, Gay Votes Can Make a Difference. It's an interview with Jeff Graham, the executive director of Georgia Equality, one of the largest gay advocacy and lobbying groups in the state. And if you turn your attention to the 4th paragraph from the bottom, he provides the following answer to a question. I think we have certainly seen in the last 20 years that I have lived here, there have been a number of close elections and runoff scenarios when both the winners and the losers have conceded that strength of the LGBT vote was a deciding factor in those races. When you have a voting history that goes back 20 years or more, the political establishment begins to realize that it actually is a vote that can make a difference. But using your definition of political power, gays and lesbians don't have a meaningful degree of political power in Atlanta, correct?
That's correct. And I would actually go on to suggest that there are a number of problems with claims being made here. The first problem is that this claim is being made by an advocate for a gay and lesbian action organization. Not surprisingly, as you can imagine yourself, advocates for organizations want to present the power of their organization in the most positive light, because their job is to raise money and to mobilize forces on behalf of the group. People historically don't give money to donate to us. We are very unlikely to make a difference. So the strategy that we would use, and indeed any advocate would use, would be to overstate to the extent possible the political influence you have. Actually, I know a little bit about Atlanta. So Atlanta, of course, was one of the locations where there were violent attacks on a gay bar by an individual who was subsequently identified as potentially involved in the Olympics bombing. You will all recall. I also know that Georgia is one of the top 10 states that does not have an anti-discrimination provision in its state statute. So I don't think we can look at the certainty or well-intended boast of a political advocate and conclude that this is a convincing analysis of the political circumstances in the city of Atlanta's politics.
Isn't it true that in the most recent runoff for mayor, both candidates were actively seeking the vote of the LGBT community?
That well may be the case. It still doesn't mean that the group is determinative of the outcome or that they have a particular input on matters of city policy.
Well, let's look at the sources of political power. I think you identified several. One of them would be money, correct? That's a source of political power in the United States.
Yes.
And that's one of the ways to cajole a legislator is to make campaign contributions to him or her, correct?
Or threaten to make contribution to his or her potential opponent.
Either way, you can get power that way.
Yes.
And for some groups, their biggest political resource is their cash, correct?
Yes, but I think that varies a little bit by group. So, for example, things like trade associations, when we think of groups representing groups of corporations, they don't really have voters to mobilize. So money is their contribution to the political system. In other cases, votes are actually a much bigger deal. So we can think of some demographic groups who turn out to vote in large numbers, even though they don't have a particularly great amount of resources. So it's an uneven balance, and it just depends on the type of group. It varies from group to group.
And some groups have a meaningful degree of political power, largely because of their financial resources, correct?
Well, I would be willing to agree with that, yeah.
In assessing the political power of a group, the size of the group is clearly an important factor, correct?
Clearly.
And in terms of other factors that might be as important, one such other factor would be financial resources because they play such a large role in the political system, correct?
That's correct.
And the LGBT community and their allies outraised the yes on 8 groups, correct?
In nominal dollars donated to the campaign fund tracked by the FPPC, that's correct.
They raised approximately $43 million. The no on 8 groups did. Is that correct?
That's my understanding.
And the yes on 8 groups raised approximately $40 million. Is that correct?
In nominal dollars, yes, that's my understanding.
All right. Now, let's turn to tab 18, which is DIX 1329. It's the 2008 annual report for the Human Rights Campaign. And I'd like to direct your attention to page 14. The page numbers appear at the bottom left-hand part of the page in microscopic font.
Microscopic print.
Tell me when you're there, sir.
To the extent I can see it, I am there.
Turning your attention to the right-hand series of numbers under revenue and support, it lists total revenue and support $45.97 million for the year 2008. Do you see that?
Yes.
All right, and that's a lot more than the NAACP raised in 2008, isn't it?
I have no idea.
Your Honor, we would move the admission of DIX 1329.
No objection, Your Honor.
1329 is admitted.
Political participation in the form of resource contributions is a luxury item in economic terms, correct?
Yes. So if we have scarce resources and you need to allocate them across food, rent, health insurance, then political contributions for most people would rank lower on the list.
Then food.
Then food.
You would want to look at the disposable income of individuals in a group to know their ability to contribute financially, correct?
That would be one issue we would look at. That's correct.
But you have not undertaken an economic analysis of what the disposable income available to gays and lesbians is in the United States, correct?
I have not.
You do not have an opinion as to what the median income is for gay men in the United States, correct?
I do not.
And you do not have an opinion as to what the median income is for lesbians in the United States, correct?
No.
And you do not have an opinion on whether gays and lesbians have less disposable income than heterosexuals, correct?
I don't have an opinion on that.
But one factor that affects the level of disposable income is the number of dependents in a household, because that dependents absorb resources, correct?
That's true.
And it's true that on average, gay male couples are less likely to have children in their household than heterosexual couples, correct?
That seems likely.
And in fact, I'd like to direct your attention to tab 19, which is DIX 1162. This is a report authored by Lee Badgett and others, March 2009. Directing your attention to page 6, top of the page, it states, about half, 48.7% of married couples have children under 18 years old, compared to 27.3% of lesbian couples and 11.3% of gay male couples. And you don't have any reason to doubt those numbers, do you?
I don't know their source, so I can't speak to them in any way.
Your Honor, we would move the admission of DIX 1162.
No objection, Your Honor.
Very well, 1162 is admitted.
But you would agree that the number of gays and lesbians who actually make contributions to political causes is quite high, correct?
Well, I would have to ask quite high with respect to what? So if you're asking as a percentage of the known population of the group, well, I haven't undertaken an analysis of that. My suspicion would be that that's correct. That among gays and lesbians, we could observe a higher proportion of them would give money to politics for all the reasons we have already discussed here today. The frequency with which their identity is a source of political contestation, the relative size of the contributions, and the relative number of individuals giving contributions. I'm less confident about that. But because gays are such a small portion of the population, a very small group of people that has to make an awful lot of donations.
Now, you would agree, though, that the internet has made it easier for gays and lesbians to mobilize politically, correct?
I believe that the internet has made it easier for everyone to mobilize politically. Political scientists have seldom observed such a change in political circumstances as we have in the last 20 years.
But isn't it the internet particularly useful for groups who wish to remain invisible?
Well, I would think that it certainly makes life a little bit simpler for them. That's true.
Now, with the $43 million that the No on 8 groups were able to raise, did they spend a lot of that on TV ads?
I actually don't know the internal workings on the 8 campaign. My own perusal of the television suggests that they spent a fair amount of money on television, yes.
And they were able to get their message out to the voters to get the voters' attention. Is that fair to say?
Oh, they were able to get the message out. The reason I'm a little bit cautious here is that campaign activities take place in a variety of different contexts. Some of them are in advertising. Some of them are precinct walking. Some of them are get out to vote efforts immediately before an election day. Some of them are absentee ballot efforts. So when I look at the total amount of effort put forward, it's much harder to say whether or not the campaign feels it was conducted effectively or whether they would do things differently or whatever. I think it's fair to say that many Californians saw a commercial on the subject of Prop 8 for the No campaign.
Now, let's turn our attention to access. You agree that it's a good thing for a group in terms of its political power if it has regular access to important political figures, correct?
That would depend on a definition of access, which I believe we have to be careful in defining. So access implies the meaningful opportunity to strongly signal to a decision maker what your preferences are and to have that decision maker respond to that one. Nevertheless, certainly meeting with an elected official is better for the group than not meeting with the elected official.
Access to federal office holders is the most valuable favor that a party is able to give in exchange for large donations, correct?
Access to federal, I'm inclined to agree with that, but I'm trying to think if there are other things within the law, boundaries of the law, that a party could agree to provide in exchange for contribution. So it seems reasonable.
All right. And access in itself shows that, in a general sense, an office holder favors someone or that someone has influence on the office holder, correct?
Objection, Your Honor, compound question.
All right. I'll break it apart. Access in itself shows that, in a general sense, an office holder favors someone, correct?
No.
Or access shows, in a general sense, that someone has influence on the office holder, correct?
I'm going to say no again. And the reason I'm resistant to both of those things is that there's a fine tradition in both Washington and Sacramento of providing access to both sides in order to accept their contribution, etc. So it's not clear that just access alone suggests that that person favors your viewpoint.
You can't identify a single issue on which the leaders of the LGBT community have been unable to get a hearing before Nancy Pelosi on correct during her speakership.
Well, of course. I mean, I don't know the private communications in Speaker Pelosi's office, so as a factual matter, I don't know the answer to the question. If you're asking me, do I believe that gays and lesbians are able to meet with Speaker Pelosi? I would assume that that is so. She's a Democratic representative. Representing the city and the county of San Francisco. So it would seem unlikely that she would refuse to meet them. And she has been vocally supportive of a number of gay issues, though. She is resisting bringing some things to vote, but I think that's what I know about that.
All right. Now, I would like to direct your attention to tab 20 in your binder.
Okay,
Do you have a chart before you?
I do.
And you spoke in terms of political power, that one thing you need to assess is the feeling that the general public has towards a group, correct?
Correct.
And you made reference to a feeling thermometer, correct?
That's correct.
And if you look at this chart, we can see that in the 6th column it says GL mean temp. And that's the temperature for the gay and lesbian community, correct?
That's correct.
And in 1984 it stood at 30. Is that right?
Because I can't see the wording of the questions, I don't know for sure that it's always the same question. But if you represent to me that it is, then yes, it appears that the mean thermometer score was 30 in 1984.
And today it's at 49.4, correct?
That's correct.
And so that we see that there's been a consistent trend in terms of a more favorable, more warm feeling towards gays and lesbians in the United States over the last 25 years, correct?
Correct, with a footnote, and that is that there is a possibility of a secular trend in the feeling thermometers of all respondents on all groups. So I would want to net that out because I don't have all the data at my hands. I mean, I can't do it out of thin air. But there could be a secular trend in favor of warmness. But it is the case that those numbers have gone up. Yes.
Is that in the form of global warming?
Among the electorate, Your Honor, yes. We like everybody better now.
Now, let's talk about allies. You referenced the importance of allies during your direct testimony, correct?
I did.
And you would agree that allies can be a source of political power, correct?
Yes, with constraints. So not every ally is in the position to provide the assistance of the group needs at a particular time. So it's going to be particular to the area of contestation. For example, a state legislative ally can't help you in Congress, as a simple example. And then the second would be that some allies are more reliable than others, as I have indicated.
And in your opinion, an ally is a group or individual who is repeatedly embracing the gay position from the perspective of gays and lesbians, correct?
I would go a step further and say that an ally is an individual or group who are willing to expend political capital on behalf of that position, not merely embrace it.
And I would like to actually, I think this will be the only time I will make you do this. Go back in your binder, for which I apologize, but back to tab 14. And this is a book entitled Gays and Lesbians in the Democratic Process. And you contributed a chapter to this book. Is that right?
I did.
And we can see it on the third page behind the tab. Your chapter is called Institutions Matter, Local Electoral Laws, Gay and Lesbian Representation and Coalition Building Across Minority Communities, correct?
That's correct.
And I would like to direct your attention to page 236.
Okay.
And the last paragraph on the page starts, "The value of coalition building is clearly not lost on the gay and lesbian leadership, who have worked for years to build partnerships with racial and ethnic groups, friendly religious groups such as Jews, organized labor, and other organized interests." And that's a true statement, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now I'd like to direct your attention to tab 21 in your binder, which is DIX 1331.
I'm sorry, that tab number again?
Tab 21.
Thank you.
It's DIX 1331, which is the Human Rights Campaign Annual Report for 2009.
I'm there.
And it starts on the second page of this document in all caps. "Finally, with strong allies in the White House and Capitol Hill and across the country." Would you agree that the Obama administration is more favorable to the political interests of gays and lesbians than the Bush administration was?
So that was a nice little switch. So I would agree, yes, that Obama is more favorable than Bush, though I think the degree of difference is far smaller than most progressive voters anticipated. I would not agree with the capitalized notion that finally there are strong allies, etc.
Let's turn to page 5 of this document and to the first bullet point, which says, "The President launched a national AIDS strategy and set key goals to lower the number of new HIV infections, increase the number of people receiving care, and reduce racial disparities." And that's evidence that President Obama is an ally of the LGBT community, correct?
It strikes me that it's not a particularly persuasive point because for a number of reasons. The first is that an equally plausible explanation is that the president is an ally of public health. Second, and this is going to sound strange, but actually HIV prevention, particularly in the lesser developed world, was an area of strength for President Bush. In fact, it's one of the most laudable aspects of his administration that groups both gay and straight gave him substantial credit for. So I'm not able to evaluate the Bush administration's anti-HIV strategy vis-a-vis the Obamas, but it's not clear on its face that this is necessarily a big step on behalf of gays.
How do you know what this is talking about? Are you familiar with the initiatives and strategies that are referenced here?
The specifics of them, no, I'm not.
Okay. Now let's turn to the second bullet point. We're on our way to eliminating the HIV travel ban. To get here, HRC lobbied Congress effectively, resulting in the vote that paved the way. Then when the Department of Health and Human Services issued a proposed regulation, HRC members submitted 17,000 of the 19,000 public comments that HHS received. Soon the process will be complete and the discriminatory ban will be gone. And that's been something that the LGBT community has sought, correct?
That is something that the LGBT community has sought in concert with the scientific community.
And that's evidence of the political power of the LGBT community, correct?
Well, I would not go quite so far. So the first is that we are talking about a letter writing campaign to an administrative oversight agency, which is not a particularly high salient undertaking, kind of flies under the political radar. The second is that there was huge pressure on the part of the university medical centers receiving NIH grants to eliminate the HIV travel ban because it put U.S. AIDS researchers, who are among the world's leading AIDS researchers, in the uncomfortable position of not being able to host the International AIDS Conference in the United States because individuals with HIV could not actually attend. So there are a lot of different forms of public pressure on this issue prior to the proposed regulation change, which did in fact go into effect.
And turning to the next bullet point, it says, "We advocated for the administration to ban discrimination on the basis of gender identity in the nation's largest workforce, the federal government," and they did. And that's something that the LGBT community has sought, correct?
It's something that they sought.
And it's evidence of the political power of the LGBT community, correct?
It is certainly one outcome that would weigh positively My understanding was that this was done in the form of a presidential directive. So I'm not sure of the legislative vibrancy of this, if it will survive the administration, but it's certainly a positive consideration.
Your Honor, would it be possible to take a short break?
You mentioned lunch and breaks and so forth, Mr. Thompson. I think we're all grateful for your suggestions.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Why don't we take 10 minutes? Is that enough?
Yes, thank you, Your Honor.
Very well, Mr. Thompson. I trust the break shortened your cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. Now, we would like to move the admission of DIX 1331, which was the document we were just discussing, the Human Rights Campaign Annual Report.
Your Honor, I want to object. I'm a little concerned that at some point proponents are going to cite these documents as somehow stating truthful facts. They haven't called witnesses on these issues, statements in these documents. They are opinion. They are hearsay. I don't think we have an objection to judicial notice, so they are available to the court to refer to, but I do object to this type of document going into substantive evidence.
I understand your position. The witness is being asked about these documents. I think in fairness for all parties and the completeness of the record, it's appropriate to admit these. The testimony is what it is. And I realize that these statements do not necessarily establish the truth of the content, but they certainly provide a basis for the witness's testimony and the witness's cross-examination by Mr. Thompson, and I think it is appropriate. However, they are characterized as either admitted or judicial notice. I think it's essentially immaterial.
Thank you, Your Honor. So we would like to, with the court's permission, play a short clip from a speech from President Obama. Would like you to watch this clip and react.
Well, this is the 20th of January, isn't it?
Using your definition of a political ally, does President Obama, does he count as a political ally to the gay and lesbian community?
Given my concerns about the unreliability of allies in the illustrations I have used, I think President Obama is perhaps the best illustration of an ally who cannot be counted upon, an ally whose rhetoric far exceeds his actions. Surely you would agree that there's a difference between giving a nice speech and actually accomplishing some sort of policy change.
You believe, in fact, that President Obama is, at best, lukewarm and maybe even indifferent to gay rights, correct?
I believe that he has some significant reservations about the issue, particularly on same-sex marriage. He articulated repeatedly during the 2008 campaign that he was not in favor of same-sex marriage. Since his inauguration into office, there have been no administrative action on suspending discharges under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. His words notwithstanding, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act is not on its way to final passage. His administration has defended the Defense of Marriage Act in court and continues to do so in multiple lawsuits. When the Prop 8 sister resolution emerged in the state of Maine, he, Organizing for America, which is the remnants of his campaign from a year ago, sent emails into Maine asking for them to make calls into the New Jersey and Virginia gubernatorial races, but without a single mention of the same-sex ballot initiative that was on the ballot at the very same time. The same was true for the Washington State Initiative. So in fact, most gay activists with those who I work, I am familiar with, and the leadership of most gay organizations, with the possible exception of the Human Rights Campaign notably, feel that President Obama has been particularly disappointing as an erstwhile ally.
Now, he did sign the hate crimes legislation, correct?
He did sign the Defense Authorization Act, on which hate crime was an amendment, yes.
And then he had a signing ceremony in the Rose Garden, correct?
He did.
And in determining whether President Obama was an ally of gays and lesbians, one thing you would look at, too, is whether he has spoken publicly about the adverse treatment of gays and lesbians in society, correct?
That's correct. And that's, on that dimension, President Obama is a very good speech maker.
And another factor you would consider in assessing whether President Obama was an ally of gays and lesbians is whether he has introduced legislation on behalf of LGBT political goals, correct?
Well, strictly speaking, of course, the administration doesn't introduce legislation, but yes, if his administration was working with an author on the Hill to submit a piece of legislation that he pledges up front to sign, that would be a positive factor to consider.
And he has pledged to sign the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, correct?
He has. I heard the video.
And that's passed the House of Representatives, correct?
It has.
Now, using your definition of ally, Senator Feinstein is only a soft ally of gays and lesbians, correct?
I think given her, the record over the course of her political career, that's the way I would describe it.
And in considering whether gays and lesbians have reliable allies, you would define a reliable ally as one who, when faced with political threat, when faced with alternative agenda items, is willing to set aside alternative items and sale into stiff wins in order to act on behalf of gays and lesbians, correct?
I think that would be one aspect I would want to consider. For example, as the opinion polls in the support of the Democratic administration have waned over the course of the last 12 months, the Speaker, who, as we recall from the earlier question, represents the city and county of San Francisco, the Speaker has indicated that particularly controversial social matters, including gay rights issues, that the House of Representatives would not take them up until the Senate acted first. That's an example of not wanting to sail into stiff winds. Another example might be, for example, the setting aside of any question of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell or Defense of Marriage Act issues until after the economy or healthcare is dealt with, etc. So one of the tropes that people would use to not enact protections for gays and lesbians is that there are other priorities, or to do so would endanger our coalition behind Bill X or Bill Y. And so this is a fairly constant refrain that gay and lesbian advocacy leaders hear when they are asking for a legislation to be moved forward.
Now, using your definition of reliable political ally, you're not even sure the ACLU would qualify as a reliable ally, correct?
Well, I'm actually willing to concede that the ACLU is a pretty reliable ally because sailing into stiff winds appears to be what they are willing to do. That's not to say that they never shrank from an issue. They may have, but I think they are probably more reliable than most other groups.
But when I asked you during your deposition, and I would like to direct your attention to, I believe it's tab 3 of your binder, page 88. We were talking about the definition of reliability on 88, line 6. And then towards the end of 88, you mentioned that there may be some allies who are willing to pay costs to support gay and lesbian causes. And then when we go to 89, I said, question, well now, you said very few. Answer, well, I said there could be individuals in my answer. Question, okay. Answer, but in terms of large organized forces in the society, maybe the American Civil Liberties Union, I don't know. I mean, I'm struggling. I'm sure if I spent all day, I could probably think of an ally or two, and you gave that testimony, correct?
I did, which I believe is consistent with what I just said, that the ACLU is probably an ally, yeah.
Now, you don't have sufficient information to know whether Speaker Pelosi meets your definition of a reliable ally, correct?
I don't have maybe all the pertinent information. I would see her as more likely than not an ally, but her level of reliability I would condition by her responsibility and desire to protect the Democratic majority and perhaps put off controversial vote.
And that could be a sound strategy even from the perspective of the LGBT community, correct?
Well, that depends. It could be a sound strategy if it creates the opportunity for the majority to live to fight another day. Alternatively, it could be, and I think there is some evidence to suggest, that by delaying certain priorities of court constituencies or groups that you have a long-term representational relationship with, that in fact on the claim that you do so to live to fight another day, that when the next day comes, you are no longer there, and so the legislative priority was sacrificed for no gain. So I think it remains an open question whether this is a sound strategy or not.
All right. Now, let's talk about the importance of the media. The media can be important in terms of figuring out the political power of a group, correct? It's a relationship to the media.
You would have to be a little bit more specific. I mean, I'm afraid to which media you are speaking.
Well, television could be important to the way in which a group is portrayed on television. Could be important.
Entertainment, television, or news?
News.
Television news?
Yes.
Yes. I would say that TV news might be relevant.
Okay. And one of the materials you deemed relevant in this case is a book by Jon Keel entitled The Nature and Origins of Mass Opinion, correct?
That's correct.
I would like to direct your attention to tab 23, which has the first few chapters of that book, which is DIX 296. And the thesis of Mr. Keel is that public opinion responds more directly to lead cues than bubbling up from the masses, correct?
That's a fair version, yeah.
And you would agree that he is right in the general sense that the stories that the media covers raises the salience of an issue, correct?
Within constraints, yes. I mean, there are some issues that, whether the media covers or not, remain present. And then there are some issues that the media might not devote a lot of attention to. And even political leads might cure a great deal that the public never buys onto. So it's certainly not a perfect relationship. But in general, if the media covers a story more frequently and with greater intensity, the public is likely to respond by thinking it's more important.
Your Honor, we move the admission of DIX 296.
No objection, Your Honor.
Very well, DIX 296 is admitted.
Excellent. And turning to the next tab, Professor, this is an article entitled Minority Group Interests and Political Representation, Gay Elected Officials in the Policy Process. And it's DIX 1102. And this was an article you considered.
I'm sorry, my next tab is a 2005 report by HRC.
Okay, let me, if the binder is missing that information, we can provide that later.
Okay, so are you under tab A?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm with you.
And this is an article you considered in reaching your opinions on this case, correct?
One of several, yes.
All right. Now I would like to direct your attention to page 575, the second paragraph, and the article states here, most important gay political representation significantly influences the adoption of domestic partner benefits. However, unlike the registration model, it is not the most influential factor. Instead, elite support has the greatest influence. Is that consistent with the point Keel is making?
It would be consistent, but unless I look at the results directly, I'm going to have a tough time giving you a sort of specific response to the claim.
Your Honor, we would move the admission of DIX 1102.
No objection, Your Honor, though I will make a standing objection concerning the hearsay nature of these documents, but I will not make it again.
Very well, 1102 is admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, Professor, you would agree that the frequency of media coverage has increased in recent years for issues relating to gays and lesbians, correct?
I would. I'm still grappling with the last question, but yes, I would agree that media coverage is higher.
And therefore, the salience or the visibility of the gay and lesbian community, at least on that dimension, has increased, correct?
That's probably true, yes.
And I would like to direct your attention to tab 24. This is the Human Rights Campaign 2005 Annual Report. It's DIX 1327. I'd like to direct your attention to page 19. And the pagination appears in the upper right-hand corner of the even pages. We did not paginate it.
I see.
Are you there, sir?
I am with you.
In the second paragraph on page 19, it states, in 2005, our message of fairness has reached 90% of Americans with a quote in it, at least one newspaper every day, and that would be an indication that the gay and lesbian community is able to get its message out through the media on a regular basis, correct?
It would be a claim that the gay and lesbian community can get its message out on a regular basis.
Do you have any basis to dispute that claim?
Oh, yes.
You don't think that they're getting a quote in the paper once a day?
I believe they are getting a quote in the paper once a day.
Okay. Well, that's what they claim here.
Well, no. Their claim is that 90% of Americans have seen the quote.
It has reached 90% of Americans now?
Newspaper readership in the United States is significantly below 50% of the population. So newspaper media is certainly news stories about gays and lesbians is not likely to yield a 90% contact rate. So, with that said, I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Now, does that mean that the newspapers serving localities that have 90% of the population have published at least one quote about gays and lesbians? Absolutely. But does that mean that 90% of Americans have been reached with HRC message? I think we have a political advocate again advertising their importance.
Your Honor, we would move the admission of DIX 1327.
Very well, 1327 is admitted.
And during the year and a half that you have lived in this area, you can't recall any editorial from the San Francisco Chronicle that was hostile to the interests of gays and lesbians, correct?
I do not read the Chronicle every day, but I would find it unlikely.
But you do read the New York Times, correct?
Again, not every day, but I read it fairly frequently, yes.
And in the last 10 years, you don't recall any instance in which the New York Times took a hostile position to the interests of gays and lesbians, correct?
I don't recall one.
You do recall editorials in the New York Times advocating for the dissolution of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, correct?
I do.
And advocating for the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, correct?
Yes.
I would like to direct your attention to the next tab, which is DIX 1323, and it's the Human Rights Campaign Annual Report for the year ended March 31st, 2000. And turning your attention to page 3, which is the 5th page behind the tab, the 3rd paragraph from the bottom. Second sentence states, reporters and editorial boards view our advocacy as common sense rather than special interest. Is that a true statement that editorial boards view the position of the gay and lesbian political community as common sense?
It's a blanket statement, and like most academics, I'm deeply uncomfortable with the blanket statement. I would be willing to represent that it would be my belief in the absence of analysis, that the majority of editorial boards with some regional variation accounted for probably tend to favor some protections for gays and lesbians. I don't believe that that's uniform across the issue, so you would have to have more editorial boards, for example, favoring hate crime laws than a non-discrimination law, and more favoring a non-discrimination law than same-sex marriage, for example. I also think that there would be a dramatic variation by region. So there would be parts of the country where this would clearly not be true. So I guess I'm at a loss for information to evaluate this, but it strikes me as particularly overboard.
Your Honor, we would move of the admission of DIX 1323.
Very well, 1323 is admitted. And remind me, Mr. Thompson, what page were you looking at?
I was looking at page 3, Your Honor.
Page
3. We have Xeroxed the cover, so it's actually the 5th page in the exhibit.
But it's marked page 3.
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you, sir.
Certainly. And now, directing your attention, Professor Segura, to tab 26. This is an editorial from the New York Times dated September 29th, 2008. And it's entitled, Preserving California's Constitution. In the 3rd paragraph, and it's addressing Proposition 8. In the 3rd paragraph, the 3rd sentence says, it is our fervent hope that Californians will reject this mean-spirited attempt, embedded second-class treatment of one group of citizens in the state constitution. Is it fair to say that the New York Times emphatically supports the rights of gays and lesbians to marry?
Well, I would certainly conclude from this editorial that they certainly fervently oppose Proposition 8. I would assume in the absence of an editorial to the contrary that they would extend that to other states as well.
And let's turn your attention to tab 33.
I'm there.
And this is a document that appeared on the LA Times, one of their blogs. And in the first bullet point under the picture, there's a quote from the LA Times editorial, and it says, "It's the same sentence as in 2000, only marriage between a man and a woman is valid or recognized in California. Yet, the issue that will be put before voters November 4th is radically different. This time, the wording would be used to rescind an existing constitutional right to marry. We fervently hope that voters, whatever their personal or religious convictions, will shudder at such a step and vote no on Proposition 8. And this reflects that the LA Times emphatically supported the No on 8 campaign.
It would appear to be a reflection of both the LA Times support for the No on 8 campaign and the fondness for the word fervently in editorials.
Now, another factor that is a source of political power is that cohesion and size of a political group, correct?
I think that's true.
And you believe that 4 to 7% of the U.S. population is openly gay or lesbian, correct?
Well, as you and I discussed during my deposition, there is a broad scholarly disagreement over the size of gay and lesbian population. And I believe my answer in deposition is the same one I will give now, which is that it is my belief that the answer is somewhere between 4 and 7% based on some marketing polling that I have observed. Places that are not particularly political, so we tend to get a few more honest answers. I've seen numbers as low as 2 and as high as 10, both of which I think to be unlikely. We're sort of too conservative and too permissive. So I think 4 to 7 is a more accurate estimate, but again, that's based on reading literally dozens of stabs at this in both the scholarly and the marketing literature.
All right, but that doesn't include bisexuals, correct?
No.
With respect to the percentage of the U.S. population that is predominantly bisexual, you've only seen numbers in the neighborhood of 2%, correct?
2% or less. But again, that's another number that has some definitional problems with it. So I know that the court heard some testimony yesterday on this issue, but it's a bisexual. Is a bisexual someone who's only engaged in sex with alternating partners, or are we defining it in with their sexual behavior in the last year or the last 5 years? So I think it's a little bit more of a porous category, a little harder to define.
In terms of cohesion, 23% of gays and lesbians are estimated to have voted in favor of George W. Bush in 2004, correct?
That's correct, yes.
So, in fact, gays and lesbians are much less politically cohesive than African Americans, correct?
As a practical matter, it's hard to imagine a single political group that is not less cohesive than African Americans, who vote Democratic somewhere between 89 and 90% in most elections. So 77% voting Democrat and 23% voting Republican would be less cohesive than African Americans. A significant degree more cohesive than Latinos and certainly Anglos.
Small group can be politically powerful, correct?
It depends on what you mean by group. Are we talking about a demographic group here? Are we talking about like an organization or an association?
Well, a small demographic group can be politically powerful. The Jewish community has a meaningful degree of political power in the United States, correct?
Oh, I would say the Jewish community has a meaningful degree of political power based on their representation in public office and their resources. But I'm not sure, I haven't undertaken an analysis of that community, but that would be my conclusion, at least at the end of, without anything about it a lot.
And a small group could be powerful in a closely divided electorate, correct?
Well, that's always true. So the closer an election, the more likely it is the smaller segments of the population can make a difference. For a group to make a credible claim that they played a role in the outcome of the election, the margin within the group would have to exceed the margin of victory overall.
So, when the then Senator Obama and Senator Clinton were battling it out for the Democratic primary, they both actively sought the support of the gay and lesbian community, correct?
I think it's fair to say that's true. I think it's also fair to say that in the very close primary contest, they actively sought the support of every person with a pulse and a voter registration card.
But they had special attention to the gay and lesbian community because of the financial resources, correct?
By special attention, are you suggesting that they paid more attention to gays and lesbians than they did to other Democratic constituencies? Because I actually don't know that to be true.
Well, to anyone with a pulse. In other words, they weren't indifferent. You just said, oh, well, they wanted everyone with a pulse. Isn't it true that they were more focused on the gay and lesbian community than just anyone with a pulse off the street?
I don't have any evidence of that. I think it would certainly be fair to say that both Senator Obama and then Senator Clinton actively courted organized labor, actively courted gays and lesbians, actively courted environmentalists, African American, Latinos, etc. It's the term special that I'm reacting to. I'm afraid because the term special appears to suggest that they paid more attention to gays and lesbians than to other Democratic constituencies, and I actually just don't know that to be true.
Are the gay and lesbian community, is that a Democratic constituency?
I think by any major or by any measure, it's a majority Democratic constituency, yes.
All right. Now, persuasion can also be a source of political power, correct?
That's a more complex question. So Dahl speaks about persuasion, and he identifies persuasion as one of the weakest forms of political power. Persuasion has multiple components to it. So it is more than merely a group saying, please pass a piece of legislation for us, or it's the right thing to do. Persuasion involves, particularly for this instance, they need to identify external, deeply held norm in society to which you can appeal. So, for example, this society has norms of equality or norms of fairness. And in the order for persuasion to be used, what a group would have to do is to say, we all believe in equality. We all believe in fairness. Those norms should apply to us. And if you apply those norms to us, then you should change your vote and be persuaded of the rightness of our position. So persuasion actually relies not only on the oratorical skills of the group, but also the degree to which the audience holds the deeply internalized norms about what the society thinks and is willing to assign include the subject group in those norms. So it's much more tenuous undertaking, and for that purpose, I think that's why Dahl sees it as the weakest form of power.
But you would agree a group might cajole a legislator by appealing to a societal norm of justice or fairness, correct?
I would if I believed that a group would certainly make the effort and may actually yield some number of changed cards, yes.
And the abolitionists in the 19th century were able to make claims on norms of fairness, correct?
They were. But I wouldn't look at that as the principal source of power for the abolitionists.
But you would agree that among the strategies that the Black Civil Rights Movement used was an intellectual or idea-based appeal to the internalized national norm of fairness, correct?
Well, I believe that was a strategy, but it would hardly be the most important or even the most frequently used. If we peruse the history of the Black Civil Rights Movement, African-American activists fighting for their civil rights engaged in a whole host of strategies, including boycotts of business, boycotts of the Montgomery bus line, sit-down strikes at Southern lunch counters, freedom rides where Northern blacks, and Northern whites boarded buses and rode into the South to defy the segregation of Southern facilities. A strategy that took them into the courts, a strategy that took them into the television sets. So serendipity, frankly, played a role. One of the reasons we have the Voting Rights Act is that the attack by Alabama officials on African-American activists at the Edmund Pettus Bridge happened to be televised live by CBS and spill into people's living rooms. So there are many more strategies and tactics used by the Black Civil Rights Movement. Certainly the idea of justice played an important role. It was not the only role.
And gays and lesbians make appeals to the norm of fairness in pursuing their political agenda, correct?
Yes, they do.
And such appeals to fairness may, in fact, persuade some number of people, correct?
They may, in fact, persuade some number of people, yes.
Now, in terms of social sources of political power, another would be tactics. The tactics that a group uses can have ramifications for the amount of power that they have, correct?
Yes, with the following qualification. Sometimes you are suggesting that tactics shape how much power a group has, and I would think that normally the casual arrow is in the reverse, that how much power a group has really shapes the tactics that they chose. So I wouldn't put a casual relationship in the way that you are suggesting.
Are you saying that tactics are irrelevant to the political power of a group?
I did not. I said that they were a non-recursive relationship.
Well, you've read press reports suggesting that the No on 8 people themselves felt like they did not do a particularly good job on reaching out to blacks and Latinos, correct?
I have read reports suggesting that they feel like, they felt like they had maybe not done the best outreach there, yes.
And you have no reason to doubt those reports, correct?
I don't know enough about the internal organization of the Prop 8 campaign, but I have no reason to question it.
All right. Now let's talk about how violence pertains to the political power of a group. In a democratic process, violence is usually negatively perceived, correct?
That is usually the case, yes.
And within a democratic process, violence historically backfires, correct?
Yes, depending on the willingness of external authorities to become involved. So there have been moments, frankly, when violence was effectively used, for example, by segregationists around the turn of the century, the Klan and others, to disenfranchise large numbers of people. So there have been unfortunate moments in our history when political forces have used violence to actually achieve their goals. As a general question, I think I would certainly not favor it, and I think it's a fundamentally anti-democratic thing to do.
Sympathy is a tool to help secure political outcomes by seeking to activate internalized norms of fairness and equity, correct?
Again, a qualified yes. And the reason is that certainly the audience, in this case, the electorate, being sympathetic to your goals or to your personal circumstances is better than being hostile. But the way you say sympathy as a tactic suggests that there is a sort of premeditation that a particular political force goes out and maybe, I don't know, cries, woe's me in the corner. Sympathy as a tactic is something I'm having a little bit of trouble wrapping my mind around.
Well, if a group is trying to use an appeal to an internalized norm of fairness or equity, the moment it engages in violence, much of that appeal dissipates, yes or no?
Well, again, these are matters of degree. So it was certainly of the case during the Black Civil Rights Movement that there was a very strong emphasis on nonviolence in order to retain the positive support of white Northerners, for example. So in general, if the group is enjoying sympathy, then violence could ameliorate that sympathy to some degree. It would depend on how much violence and who was directed at the circumstances under which it arose and whatnot.
Well, I would like to direct your attention to your deposition in this case and to page 190, line 13. This should appear behind tab 3 in your binder.
Yes.
Okay, so if we look at page 190, line 13, you said, answer. In the democratic process, violence is usually negatively received, that in some respects, if we go back to your question about ideas, if a group is trying to use an appeal to an internalized norm of fairness or equity, the moment it engages in violence, much of that appeal dissipates. And you gave that testimony, correct?
I did.
Okay. Now,
How are we doing on time, Mr. Thompson?
well, Your Honor, I appreciate Professor Segura's fulsome answers. I'm not getting yes or no answers. I'm running behind schedule, and I'm afraid there's no possible way that I could finish this evening.
Well, can you get in another half hour?
I am happy to keep going, Your Honor. Absolutely. Now, so one of the political resources that a group may have is goodwill, correct?
Correct.
All right. And if we're looking at sources or barriers to political power, you would also want to look to see if a group has been disenfranchised, correct?
Correct.
All right. And if you are not aware of any specific form of intimidation aimed at prohibiting gays and lesbians from voting, correct?
With the caveat that there may have been some number of gays and lesbians who were kept out of the franchise as consequences of felony charges associated with gay harassment in the 50s and 60s. It is possible under those circumstances that some number of gay and lesbian voters lost their right to vote as a consequence of anti-gay enforcement policies in the states. With that caveat, in the recent sense, there may have been an isolated incidence of intimidation with which I'm not familiar, but I don't know of a concerted effort to drive down the gay electorate.
Well, you can't point to any such instance, let's say in the last 30 years, of any government official anywhere in the United States targeting gays and lesbians to disenfranchise them so they can't vote, correct?
I don't have an example off the top of my head, so no, I cannot recall any.
All right, now let's talk. We have talked about the sources of political power. Let's talk about some of the indicia of political power. And would you agree that one reflection of political power is a group's ability to convince Congress to allocate funds to issues that are important to the group?
Again, with the footnote that I would want to see evidence that the group was bringing resources and pressure to bear in order to get Congress to allocate funds, is it otherwise wouldn't have. Yes. So, I mean, that would be a positive outcome that I would want to look at.
And in assessing the political power of a group, another factor you would look at would be the presence of statutory protections for their equality, correct?
Yes.
And you would also want to look at whether they had the ability to elect candidates of their choice, correct?
Oh, that would be a measure, yes.
All right. And with respect to the gay and lesbian community, you have not assumed that only a gay or lesbian would be a candidate of choice for the gay and lesbian community, correct?
No, I'm not.
Okay, and the voting rights literature has always focused on the notion of first choice without regard to the demographic characteristics of that candidate, correct?
That's correct.
And in the California legislature, there are only 4 openly gay officials, correct?
To the best of my knowledge, that number is correct.
And that's out of 120, correct?
That is correct.
And so that's 3.3% if I'm doing my math right.
I'm sorry, I can't do math that quick in my head, but if you represent that, I will take that on.
On redirect, Mr. Boutros can correct me. Now, let's talk about political power in California. And is it true that Equality California is one of the leading gay right groups in the state of California?
I actually can't really answer that because what do you mean by leading gay rights groups? There are a number of groups active. I would assume that Equality California is among the largest, if not the largest, but I don't have that basis. I don't know the budget of every group in the state.
Equality California raised more money for the No on 8 campaign than any other group. Is that right?
That sounds correct, yes.
Okay, so let's turn to tab 35, which is the 2009 legislative scorecard for Equality California. And directing your attention to the first page of text, it says, despite a tough legislative session and the worst budget crisis in California history, this year has been one of Equality California's best yet in Sacramento. We passed a record 11 pieces of Equality California-sponsored legislation that will improve the lives of LGBT Californians. Is it true that last year there were 11 pieces of legislation passed that were sought by the LGBT community?
With the caveat that some of the legislation was, in fact, non-binding resolutions that were senses of the legislator, then I would have no reason to dispute their number.
And so this was a good legislative session for the LGBT community, correct?
I think it's a different question. So that what constitutes as a good legislative session is whether or not high priority items were in fact acted upon in a positive sense and were ultimately signed into law. So again, I would have to know what the rate of bill passage was in other years, what the number of bills passed in all the other years was. I took on faith that their report that they felt pretty good about it. That they're happy with it.
All right, now let's look at their scorecard that they give to different legislators. If we look at the Senate scorecard, and you just flip the page, it has ratings of 100%. And I'll represent to you that 21 out of 40, a majority of the California Senate, has a 100% approval rating from Equality California. Is it fair to assume that any state senator who receives a 100% rating from Equality California is an ally of the LGBT community?
That would depend on which items were used to score. So, for example, we might find in a year where there were several sort of procedural issues that came up. You could get 100% from a particular representative, and in a subsequent year in which there was a much more contentious issues that came up, you would get less than 100%. So it's important to always keep in mind that the scorecard is relative to what the agenda was in the legislator that year. Some agendas are more vexing than others.
Can you point to any of these legislators who received 100% rating and provide evidence that any of them are not allies of the LGBT community?
Again, I don't have the legislator and all of their activities committed to memory. I couldn't possibly.
Well, I'm just asking for one. Can you point to one piece of evidence that one of these individuals with a 100% rating is not an ally of the LGBT community?
I cannot. I can point to the fact that there is an awful lot of zeros on the page as well, that the minority party, should they gain control of the Senate, would reverse many of the items that you've just identified.
All right. Now, let's turn to the Assembly scorecard. And again, I will represent to you that 41 out of the 80, again, a majority, have a perfect 100% score. Can you point to any evidence that any of these individuals who received a 100% rating were not allies of the LGBT community?
Once again, no. I do not have an exhaustive command of that behavior of each legislator.
Okay, now let's look at some other officials in the state of California. It's reasonable to assume that Barbara Boxer was a candidate of choice for gays and lesbians, correct?
In a general election sense, I think the answer to that is yes. I don't remember the last time she had a meaningful primary challenge. Maybe not since '92 when she was first elected.
Right, but in her recent election, she has been a candidate of choice for the gay and lesbian community, correct?
Yes, yes.
In Senator Dianne Feinstein's recent elections for U.S. Senate, she has been a candidate of choice for the gay and lesbian community, correct?
Given the choices that they have been provided, yes.
Right. I understand. And Attorney General Brown is the candidate of choice to be the next governor of California among gays and lesbians, correct?
Well, as previously discussed, approximately 77% of self-identified gays and lesbians identify as Democrats. And the last time I checked, he's the only Democrat in the field. So I would assume that approximately 77% have a predisposition to support him.
Can you identify any general election for statewide office in California in the last 10 years where the LGBT community supported the Republican candidate rather than the Democratic candidate?
I cannot.
And can you identify any Democrat running for statewide office in California in the last 10 years who won the Democratic primary over the opposition of the LGBT community?
That I'm going to have to, I'm afraid, have to plead ignorance on. I lived external to the state from 2001 until 2008, so I wasn't privy to the primary politics here.
Okay, so Senator Boxer is an ally of the gay and lesbian community, correct?
I think that's a fair assessment.
And let's talk about labor unions. Labor unions were part of the coalition, the Democratic coalition in the state of California, correct?
That's correct.
And would you agree that there certainly have been a number of moments where labor unions supported the gay and lesbian political position on matters of concern to the community, correct?
I believe a distinction I would want to make is that labor union leaders have supported a variety of issues of concern to the community.
You can't think of any instance in the last decade where labor unions have opposed the gay or lesbian community, correct?
I cannot think of an instance where labor union leaders have opposed the gay and lesbian community. The reason I'm differentiating these things is there's a difference between a coalition built at the elite level and the mass behavior of voters. So while you could probably show me an endorsement of no on 8 from a particular union, I don't actually know how the rank and file of that union voted in November of 2008.
And I would like to direct your attention to tab 41. This is a press release produced to us by Equality California. It's dated October 6th, 2008. It's DIX 2502. And it says in the first paragraph, the Unite Here International Union on Saturday made a 100,000, presumably, contribution to the Equality California's No on Proposition 8 campaign committee and announced its opposition to Prop 8, which eliminates the right of same-sex couples to marry in California. And then, turning to the third paragraph, it says, endorsing the No on 8 campaign is consistent with the long-held positions of this union, said Cleve Jones. Do you have any reason to doubt that Mr. Jones's statement that supporting the rights of the gay and lesbian community was consistent with Unite Here, the international union?
I don't. And I'm actually not surprised to see Unite Here endorsing the No on 8 campaign. Unite Here represents both needle trades and hotel and restaurant employees. And gays and lesbians are somewhat are a larger percentage of the workforce, particularly in the hotel and restaurant employees union, than they are in many other trade unions. So this is not surprising.
Okay. And if we turn to the last paragraph, there's a statement by Jeff Kors, and he is the executive director of Equality California. Is that right?
That's correct.
And he states in the second to last sentence of this press release, this contribution reflects the long-standing relationship the LGBT community has had with our union partners. And that's a fair statement, isn't it?
I presume it's a fair statement of his belief.
Well, it's an accurate statement, is it not?
Once again, I don't know that that's true. I think that it's fair to say that union leadership has been supportive of gay and lesbian causes in the state in recent decades. And Mr. Kors is commenting on that. But you are asking me to say whether or not that there is a long-standing relationship between the community and the union's membership. I don't really know that.
Your Honor, we would move the admission of DIX 2502.
Very well. Wait a minute, DIX?
2502, Your Honor.
Very well. DIX 2502.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, turning your attention to the next tab, Professor Segura, this is a printout of the union contributions that we pulled off of the California Secretary of State's website. If we did our math right, there was a $1.7 million worth of contributions by unions to the No on 8 campaign. Do you know of a single union that contributed money to the Yes on 8 campaign?
Pardon me, I do not.
And does it surprise you that all of the unions that gave were giving to the No on 8 campaign?
When you didn't ask me, I don't know if any union gave to the Yes on 8 campaign. I haven't come across that. So it's possible that one has.
All right.
If I take as a given that all the union contributions went to No on 8, it does not surprise me, given the long-standing relationship between union leadership on the one hand and the gay and lesbian movement on the other.
All right. Well, now let's turn your attention to the next tab in your binder. This is a story dated October 26, 2008, from the Sacramento Bee. And if we look at the last line on the page, the last sentence talks about influential Latinos, including the Los Angeles mayor. And can you help me with the pronunciation, Professor Antonio?
Villaraigosa.
That's what I meant to say. And leaders of the United Farm Workers Union are spreading the word that Proposition 8 is anti-civil rights. Isn't it true that unions did not confine their support to giving money, but their leadership was also out there actively working to defeat Proposition 8?
That's a blanket statement. I don't know of the actual activities of all the union leaders involved in the state of California. I couldn't speak to that. Were there some union leaders who were active? Yes.
Active in opposing Proposition 8?
That's correct.
And you can't identify any union leaders who were actively supporting Proposition 8?
No, I cannot.
Well, if we look at tech companies in California, you would agree that many of the Silicon Valley technology companies express pro-gay positions, correct?
I think it's fair to say that the Silicon Valley industry has intended to be more civil rights on many dimensions, and this being one of them. I think that's a fair statement.
All right. And large corporations in California have a meaningful degree of political power, correct?
They do with respect to the issues that concern them. So, for example, we might find that oil companies are particularly influential on environmental regulation, energy, pricing, or some forms of emissions control and things such as that. Oil companies are not particularly influential on things like kindergarten policy or classroom size, for example. So we don't identify a group as being powerful, and they are powerful in all circumstances across all issues. They are powerful with respect to the issues that discern them. I think it would be fair to say that Silicon Valley firms and large corporations are powerful here, and they are everywhere in the United States in terms of having lots of lobbyists and making lots of campaign contributions and things such as that.
And you were not aware of any circumstances in which Silicon Valley technology companies have worked against the interests of gays and lesbians, correct?
Again, I don't have an exhaustive list of their political behavior over time. I don't have an example to suggest that they haven't been.
Okay. Now, I'd like to direct your attention to tab 44, which is the 2006 annual report of the Human Rights Campaign and the Human Rights Campaign and
I'm beginning to think that you're on their mailing list, Mr. Thompson.
my new favorite website. It's DIX 1328, and it's page 13. I'd like to direct your attention to the last bullet point, and tell me when you're there, sir.
I'm there.
It says, big businesses like Microsoft backed state legislation that would protect GLBT workers. Plus, more and more businesses are supporting fair-minded legislators working to pass important bills for same-sex couples, as Nike did when it backed a civil unions bill in the Oregon legislature in 2006. Do you have any reason to doubt these statements that Microsoft and Nike and other large corporations actively are working for the rights of the LGBT community?
Well, I would clarify the statement. So there would be a number of objections I would offer. The first is that, again, this is an advocacy organization speaking on how wonderfully effective they are, which is, of course, in their interests in order to maintain their membership and their contribution base. The second is that the statement itself sort of illustrates its internal problem by saying more and more businesses are supporting fair-minded legislatures. What it's suggesting is that there are many businesses that do not. Otherwise, we couldn't have any change. And if they are suggesting change, we couldn't have a uniform level of support. The third is that it's not clear to me that each of these organizations are contributing to those legislatures because they support same-sex marriages or same-sex interests. We would want to investigate that. So those would be the things that I would sort of throw in as a caveat. As a general rule, I would not object to the statement that the trend in major businesses has moved from opposition to neutrality to support in a number of instances. I don't have an estimation of what that distribution is.
Your Honor, we've come to a convenient stopping point. I hate to be the one who looks like a slacker here, always suggesting that we take
I don't
breaks.
think anyone would make that suggestion.
But if it's...
Look, let me ask one question, and then you can follow up if you like, and then Mr. Boutros also one question, or perhaps one or two follow on. Does losing elections or failing to obtain legislation denote political powerlessness to require extraordinary protection against majoritarian political processes?
Losing an individual election, in my view, would not, because in the democratic process, some losses all contests. Let me state that again. Losing an individual election, in my view, would not, because in the democratic process, someone loses all contests. The initiative process, however, is a little bit different because it is the only circumstance where we put individual rights up to a popular vote. So we have 150 or more instances in a decade and a half where anti-discrimination protection are voted on by the population and overturned, even though the legislature or its city council or county board had granted them. We have informed passages of constitutional amendments to exclude one group of citizens from a civil institution, and that's extraordinary in my view. Now, would each individual act by itself be determinative of whether or not there should be a judicial intervention? I would say, just as I said to Mr. Thompson, that an outcome by itself is a piece of information. But we would want to know the context in which it passed. So if you look at the passage of a particular bill in the Assembly, we have the passage of a bill where the majority party votes for it and the minority party votes against it. Then we might reasonably expect that should that majority change, we could see a reversal on that. We could contrast that with an outcome which is bipartisan, for example. We can see examples where a legislator passes a bill and the public then flies an initiative to overturn it. So I would want to look at the range of events rather than a single event. And in my view, when you look at the range of events that have occurred in terms of public voting directly on questions of gay and lesbian rights, that their loss rates suggest that longstanding prejudice against gays and lesbians is shaping what their political opportunities are.
Follow up, Mr. Thompson.
No follow-up, Your Honor.
All right, very well. Then why don't we take a break at this point? How much longer do you have with Professor Segura?
I think maybe, an hour and a half more, so it depends on the length of the answers, of course, to some
Well,
extent.
Perhaps you can do as you've done before and spend some time this evening honing those questions
I will endeavor to do so, Your Honor.
so we can move along. And with that, who do we expect tomorrow's witnesses to be? Mr. Boies?
Your Honor, we're working on that after this witness completes. We basically, for the completion of our case, have probably two witnesses, Professor Hewitt and Mr. Tam. Professor Hewitt, who is planning to be our next witness, has been ill today. So if you make it tomorrow, we're going to put him on. Otherwise, we're going to go with, I may be mispronouncing, it's Herrera?
Herrick, yes.
I'm pronouncing it wrong. Professor Heyck is the one that is ill. If he is available, we would put him on following his witness. Other than that, we would put Mr. Tam on. But those are the two witnesses that we have, and then we have a number of documents to offer before we rest.
Okay, now after those two witnesses testify, do you plan any other live witnesses?
We do not. There are our two live witnesses that we plan at the present time. There is a possibility that we still may need to call Mr. Prentice to authenticate some materials, or one of the other people to authenticate materials. But the other live witnesses we would be calling would be just for the purposes of authentication of documents, which we hope we're going to work out without the necessity of calling them.
I understand the magistrate judge has, I believe, resolved the matter that was discussed before the break this morning involving some of the documents. Can counsel inform me what the situation is?
I cannot, Your Honor, but somebody.
Mr. McGill, I think you were involved in the proceeding. Were you, Mr. McGill?
Yes, Your Honor, I was. The motion to amend the core group order was, as Your Honor indicated, was granted in part and denied in part. And the defendant interveners have been produced, and we're currently reviewing all the documents that they were withholding. Pursuant to that motion to amend that they have made.
Is it the plaintiff's intention to introduce some of those documents in their case in chief?
Obviously, Your Honor, we are reviewing documents to see, but it is our intention to introduce some of those if we can resolve the authentication issues before we rest.
All right. Well then, is it unduly optimistic to think that the plaintiff may rest tomorrow?
Your Honor, I think it would be optimistic. I think it is possible. I think it would be optimistic. I think it is certain we will rest before the end of the day on Friday, but I think that with the documents that we're still getting and sort of working on parallel tracks, I think it will be challenging to finish tomorrow, but we still think that's a possibility.
All right. Well then, that means that under a very optimistic scenario, the defendants may be called upon to begin their case tomorrow, and if not, in all probability, on Friday.
Yes, Your Honor. We'll have Professor Ken Miller ready to go, Your Honor. We would expect Friday morning, so.
Very well. All right. Any housekeeping matters to attend to?
Your Honor, just one issue to update the court on. The magistrate did deny the motion to quash. Deny the motion to quash that was filed by Pastor Garlow and Pastor McPherson. So that was the other issue that he was addressing.
All right. Well, also, unless that's brought here, that should be the end of that matter.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Very well, counsel. I will see you bright and early tomorrow at 8:30.